In 1943, the skies over Europe were deadly. Hundreds of young American airmen, barely out of their teens and from every corner of the United States, climbed into their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators daily. They flew toward German industrial targets, factories, oil refineries, and rail yards, knowing the terrifying odds. Every day, dozens of these bombers were lost. The survivors described German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs swarming the formations with cannons and rockets blazing, along with the constant, dreaded anti-aircraft flak. A bomber was an easy target on its bomb run, and the shrapnel could rip the aircraft apart or tear through the fuselage, often with fatal results. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men, a pilot and co-pilot fighting heavy controls, a navigator hunched over charts, a bombardier guiding the perilous bomb run, a flight engineer, a radio operator, a ball turret gunner, 2 waist gunners, and a tail gunner. They relied on each other, but when a bomber went down, it usually took all 10 men with it. Some fortunate men bailed out to become prisoners of war, but most never escaped the aircraft. The losses were staggering. During Black Week in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 148 bombers in just 7 days. On Black Thursday, October 14th, 60 B-17s were shot down in a single mission over Schweinfurt, resulting in 600 men lost. The bombers flew that day without fighter escort, and the German fighters pressed their attacks relentlessly. Overall, 1,500 airmen were gone in that week alone. Most bomber crews had a life expectancy of just 11 missions, yet they were required to complete 25 to return home. Statistically, only about 1 in 4 crews would survive their tour. The military needed an urgent solution, as bombers were being destroyed faster than new ones could be built. The obvious idea was to add armor, but weight was as much an enemy as bullets. Every pound mattered, because adding too much weight meant less fuel, fewer bombs, or less ammunition, and could prevent the bomber from reaching operational altitude or even taking off. The critical challenge was finding the optimal placement for the limited armor they could carry. The logical approach, reached by the military's best engineers and designers, was to study where the returning planes were getting hit and armor those areas. A secret group of mathematicians and statisticians, the Statistical Research Group, or SRG, was fighting the war with equations at Columbia University. This group was an assembly of brilliant minds, including future Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman and established legends like Harold Hotelling. The atmosphere was one of urgency, with every problem solved potentially saving lives. Working among these luminaries was a quiet refugee from Austria, Abraham Wald, who had escaped the Nazis in 1938. Wald, an Orthodox Jew, had been homeschooled until university because of the Sabbath, a challenge that honed his talent for independent thought and problem-solving. After earning his doctorate in Vienna, he was shut out of academia due to rising anti-Semitism, eventually fleeing Austria after the 1938 Anschluss. Tragically, all but one of his family members who remained behind died in Auschwitz. The SRG was tasked with analyzing the urgent bomber problem. Technical crews examined hundreds of returning B-17s and B-24s, meticulously documenting every bullet hole and piece of shrapnel damage. Detailed diagrams, covered with dots representing damage, revealed clear patterns. The fuselage, wings, and tail sections showed heavy damage, topping the charts. Conversely, the engines, cockpit, and fuel systems showed surprisingly little damage. The obvious conclusion, reached by the military's best engineers and designers, was to armor the parts taking the most hits: the fuselage, wings, and tail. When the proposal reached the SRG, Abraham Wald looked at the same diagrams and asked the simple question that changed everything: where are the planes with engine damage? The other men in the room pointed to the data showing engines had less damage. But Wald realized that these diagrams only showed the planes that came back. He saw an enormous, glaring selection bias that everyone else had missed. The engineers were only studying the survivors. The planes that got shot down, the ones that crashed in German fields or were blown apart at altitude, were not available for study, and their missing damage patterns were the most important data of all. Wald realized that if a returning plane had heavy damage to the fuselage, wings, and tail, It meant those areas could absorb significant damage and still allow the plane to fly home. However, the fact that engines, cockpits, and fuel systems showed little damage on returning planes was not evidence that they were less likely to be hit. German fighters in flak aimed for the entire aircraft, and hits were distributed fairly randomly. The chilling answer was that planes hit in the engines, cockpit, or fuel systems did not return. A hit to an engine could cause an unextinguishable fire or destroy the engine outright, dooming the plane. A direct hit to the cockpit killed the crew. Damage to the fuel tanks led to catastrophic fiery explosions. The absence of damage in these areas on surviving planes was not evidence of safety. It was evidence that damage to these areas was fatal. Wald's analysis identified the profound statistical principle that later became known as survivorship bias. When you study only survivors, you miss the failures, and those missing cases often hold the most crucial information. The filtering process that determined which data you could see contained the critical information. His counterintuitive conclusion was that armor should not go on the parts with the most damage on returning planes, but on the parts with the least: the engines, the cockpit, and the fuel systems. If a plane could survive hits to the fuselage and still return, the fuselage was not the critical vulnerability. The military had been about to make a catastrophic mistake, armoring survivable areas while leaving the truly vulnerable areas unprotected. Wald developed mathematical methods to estimate the full, unbiased damage distribution, including the planes that were shot down using only the data from survivors. His technical memoranda were classified during the war, but established a principle that became embedded in military operational research for decades. The core principle was to question your sample selection, think about the missing data, and consider what you cannot see. This approach was used in subsequent conflicts, like the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Wald's contribution extended far beyond bomber armor. He had identified one of the most important concepts in critical thinking: survivorship bias, the systematic error of studying only successes, plagues business, medicine, and finance. In business, we study winning companies and successful CEOs, but ignore the thousands of identical failures who are the missing planes. In medicine, studies of patients who survive to reach the hospital miss the most severe, fatal cases who died before arrival, leading to underestimated deadliness. In finance, closed mutual funds with poor performance disappear, inflating historical return statistics. Abraham Wald taught us to ask the uncomfortable questions. What am I not seeing? What failures am I ignoring because they are not here to be counted? This requires double vision, analyzing the data you have while simultaneously imagining the data you do not have. After the war, Wald continued his groundbreaking work at Columbia, publishing Sequential Analysis in 1947, a book that grew directly from his wartime research and revolutionized how experiments are designed. He showed how scientists could make reliable decisions with less data by stopping data collection when sufficient evidence was reached, saving time, money, and even lives in medical trials. By 1950, Wald was one of the most respected statisticians in the world. In December of that year, while on a lecture trip in India, Wald and his wife Lucille tragically died when their plane crashed into the side of a mountain near Kotagiri. He was 48 years old. His legacy, though, would prove immortal. His concept of survivorship bias is now a standard topic in countless fields because it forces people to understand how biased samples can lead them astray. More than 70 years later, Wald's insight reminds us that every success story hides untold failures, and the most important data is often the data we cannot collect. In a room full of brilliant minds looking at bullet holes on returning planes, Abraham Wald was the one who saw the planes that were not there. He taught us to look for the missing planes. His disciplined thinking, rigorous mathematics, and willingness to question assumptions helped protect airmen, not through advanced weapons, but through clear thinking. The profound lesson was not in the bullet holes on the planes that came back, but in the invisible evidence of the planes that did not.